Chicago, one of the largest cities in the country, home of the greatest pizza on earth, rich in diversity, culture, and history, and a city that loves their sports teams. It's one of the biggest sports towns in America with its cult-like following for all the major sports, and that also includes one of the most iconic franchises in sports, the Chicago Bulls, and the franchise would not have reached its level of popularity and fame without the most iconic figure in sports, Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan transcended the Chicago Bulls from being an afterthought franchise to the greatest dynasty the game has ever seen. The man globalized the game of basketball, cemented himself as the greatest player of all time. And any kid growing up in the 90s wanted to be like Michael Jordan. They wanted to come out onto the court and hear their name called in the starting lineup to be that player that everyone cheered for when hoisting the Larry O'Brien trophy over their heads, winning it for the hometown fans. The number of kids in the 90s who pretended to be a big-time star like Michael Jordan while playing basketball in their driveway or the schoolyard court had to be in the millions over the course of the Bulls dynasty. And even through the down years, after Jordan retired, and despite the Bulls having never even gone back to the finals since then, the Bulls still have been able to maintain a strong global fan base because of what Michael Jordan built. Now, why is all this relevant to the topic of today's video? Well, around the time when I started the channel about a year and a half ago, when the Bulls were still considered a rebuilding team, I put out a video on the importance of Michael Jordan and his legacy, and more specifically the documentary The Last Dance, and how that would have a positive impact on Chicago becoming a free agency destination, especially with a new front office, and that you eventually would have players who would want to follow in Michael Jordan's footsteps, especially those who were young kids growing up idolizing MJ. Well, since then, that time, the Bulls have added significant pieces, most notably DeMar DeRozan, who specifically talked about this in a recent appearance on Draymond Green's podcast about the vibe and aura of playing at the United Center and how he's trying to inherit the ghost of Michael Jordan. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about DeMar's comments from that podcast interview, what it means for the Bulls' upcoming season, as well going forward when it comes to building this franchise back into a contender again. So what's going on, everyone? You are listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, if you did not catch this episode of Draymond Green's podcast, I highly recommend you check it out. It's honestly one of the most candid and real discussions you'll ever see between two NBA basketball players. I'll admit, I am not a big fan of Draymond Green. I like him as a player because he's a fighter and is a big-time X factor for the Warriors, but I've always found him to be super cocky, full of himself, and likely wouldn't get the kind of praise and attention he would get had he not been fortunate enough to play his whole career alongside Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. But what I will say, I gained a newfound respect for Draymond after watching this interview. First and foremost, I didn't realize how close him and DeMar actually are. I mean, as fans, you know the NBA is kind of like a brotherhood in which most of the guys know and respect each other, but certain bonds and friendships are closer than others, and DeMar and Draymond was not one I would have expected. And I also liked how Draymond was giving DeMar his due, despite being counted out by so many media pundits as well as fans for that matter, and cognizant of how incredible it was of a season for DeMar doing what he did and being really the only constant on this Bulls team with all their injuries that they went through, and also how special it was that he did all of this on the heels of DeMar's dad passing. Now here's the thing, the guys talked about a lot on the show. They touched a great deal on mental health, which I thought was great because it's not too often you see professional athletes showing a bit of their vulnerable side. Like I said, they talked about the passing of family members both for DeMar and Draymond Green, and how that loss of a loved one has really fueled them in striving for excellence in everything that they do. But more specifically, what I wanted to talk about was what these guys said as it relates to how historic this Bulls franchise is. Keep in mind, DeMar DeRozan and Draymond Green are both in their 30s, DeMar being 32, he's actually going to be 33 next week, Draymond Green also 32. So both of these guys are old enough to at least remember the second three-peat from the Dynasty Bulls and seeing the legendary Michael Jordan play, because the majority of players in the NBA today are getting to that point where they were either too young to remember seeing Michael Jordan play on the Bulls, or weren't even born by the time MJ retired in '98. Now, I'm one of those guys old enough to remember the Dynasty Bulls, albeit being a kid, but like so many other kids, the memory of hearing Michael Jordan's name called in that starting lineup will be something I'll never forget. I still get goosebumps to this day when hearing that starting lineup theme song, and that memory has stayed with these current NBA players who grew up in the 90s, as you saw from Draymond's words in this clip here.
Later, I hear that music and at the starting lineup, and it does something to me. I feel like Michael Jordan about to run out of the tunnel. Do y'all get that sense in playing there and getting that every single day, or is it not
For sure.
quite
Yeah, no question. It trips me out, even just driving there, bro. Like parking outside. I remember just seeing all the highlights, Jordan back in the day, parking outside, you know, like, so for me, every time I go there, bro, I feel it. Like, I'm not even gonna lie. Like, you just feel like you gotta bring it every single night, especially for those fans, man. And it's crazy. I was telling somebody, I think I was telling my I forgot who I was telling my partners this the other day. I said, the moment where I really realized, like, you gotta bring it every single night in that arena. I never spoken this, like, on nothing media, and then I think we was 4 or 5 games into the season. We was playing the Knicks, and I took the game winner. I airballed, and I just felt like the whole vibe of everything. Like, what the fuck? Like, what was that? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I felt like I disrespected the aura of what these fans is used to seeing from, obviously, MJ hitting game winners. And, you know, you live for those moments. And to be in that moment for the first time, my 4th, 5th season in the game, and I take that shot, it was like, I told myself I would never be in that situation again, to let that same feeling happen for these fans. Mm-hmm. I swear to God, bro, I never told that. It was that game to where it was like, but every shot I take in a clutch, I'm gonna make it count every single time. So you look back at all the moments that I had in the arena, it was more so like, yo, this the ghost of, like, I'm trying to inherit the ghost of Michael shooting his fadeaway with the clock running down. Like, absolutely. I carried that to heart after that moment, because you felt it from the fans. You felt it on social media when it was like, yeah, you taking that. You know what I mean? Absolutely. It was like, nah. So that's how I carry it every time I walk in there. You see Scotty, Michael, you see Bob Love, you see these jerseys up there, and it's like, and you hear this music when you come out. It's Facts. The same, you know what I mean? It's the same thing. You gotta live up to it. You got to.
Now here's the thing. Whether you were old enough to remember the 90s Bulls or not, you got to relive that amazing dynasty run by way of The Last Dance, which I'm sure most of you, if not all, have seen that by now, whether you're a Bulls fan or not. One of the greatest sports documentaries there is, not biased at all, of course, but what was great about that documentary coming out when it did was the fact that it reminded, or should I say even made aware to some of these young great players in the NBA now, how iconic this franchise is and how legendary Michael Jordan was, and that maybe there is a desire, a challenge, a chance to define one's own legacy to follow in Michael Jordan's footsteps and bringing a title back to Chicago. And you heard that in DeMar's words when talking about trying to inherit the ghost of Michael Jordan. How these fans are craving to see a title team again, to see another superstar bring this franchise back to the iconic status it once was. You know, I think the thing that surprises me the most is that despite being one of the biggest markets in the NBA, one of the greatest cities in the world, one of the biggest global sports brands in the world, you have yet to see an instance of a big name player wanting to be that guy that follows in Michael Jordan's footsteps. Like, for all of these players growing up idolizing MJ, some of them growing up as Bulls fans, you would think that there would at least be a few players wanting to play for the team they rooted for growing up. Like, you've reached that stage that a fractional percentage of basketball players ever hope to achieve, and you have a chance to bring a title back home to the city of Chicago just like Michael Jordan did back in the 90s. There has to be an element of prestige to that should be enticing to some players. I think back to the summer of 2010, one of the biggest free agency classes the league had ever seen, with the likes of LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh, Amari Stoudemire, Joe Johnson, among many others, Carlos Boozer, who was the Bulls consolation prize. Like, I remember at that time thinking at least one of LeBron James and Dwayne Wade, who were arguably the two best players in the league at that time, I thought for sure one of them would be coming to Chicago just purely for the prestige of following in their idol's footsteps and winning a title in Chicago. And it's not like the Bulls were trash at this time, so why would these big name free agents in the peak of their prime want to come play for a mediocre team? No, this was a Bulls team that was on the rise, budding young talent in Rose, Noah, and Deng, which of course that following season went on to finish with the best record in the NBA. But of course, it wasn't meant to be. Both LeBron and Chris Bosh decided to team up in Miami with Dwayne Wade, take pay cuts in order to do so, and the rest is history. But ever since then, it's been shocking to me that the allure of playing in the house that MJ built isn't there around the league. Now, I'm sure a big reason of that is because the Bulls front office hasn't been the most competent and even toxic at times as an organization, but of course, now there is a new regime in town, which should hopefully change that narrative about the organization. It's possible that it's also still the ownership who people are wary about, who have historically been cheap and trying to cut costs to save a few extra bucks rather than spending big to bring in a winning team. But even with all of that, whether you saw live growing up as a kid, or whether you got to relive that in the form of past highlights or in watching The Last Dance, which you had so many NBA players reacting to on social media when the episodes were released, you would have to think, for some players, they would say, yeah, I want to go and do that. I want to be the next guy that brings a title to Chicago after Michael Jordan did. And that's what I loved about these comments from DeMar DeRozan, is that he wants to be that guy that inherits the ghost of Michael Jordan. He wants that challenge of trying to do what the greatest player of all time did. He wants to change the narrative of the Bulls being an afterthought ever since Michael Jordan retired. He wants to be that guy. And that's what's great about this, is that it only takes one player to make this known, to bring this to the attention of all of those great young up-and-coming players, that there is a legacy to be had when you follow in Michael Jordan's footsteps and bringing a title back to the city of Chicago. That you will be loved by the city and its fans because of how much it means to them. With one player drawing attention to this fact, it will attract any player who grew up wanting to be like Mike to actually have a chance to do so. That's why these words from DeMar DeRozan are so important, because this fact is oftentimes ignored. It's easy to forget about the past, especially when it was some 25 to 30 years ago, especially when a lot of guys weren't around at that time when Michael Jordan was playing. And look, to even have one star player on the Bulls talk about this, because up until this point, no Bulls player has ever talked about the desire of inheriting the franchise that Michael Jordan built. They've maybe referenced it as a historic franchise, but never has a player on the Bulls said, I want to do what Michael Jordan did for the city. All it takes is one player to want to live that dream for others to follow. Now, maybe this is some strong hopium that I'm riding, thinking this is actually going to mean something more than it really is, and to an extent that's probably true. You can't blame a Bulls fan for thinking a little too optimistically, but I truly believe that as we see this final generation of players who grew up watching Michael, wanting to be like Michael when they were kids, wanting to hear their name called to the sound of that iconic starting lineup theme song, that there is going to be this movement of players wanting to do what Michael Jordan did, wanting to play for the most historic franchise in the NBA, bringing the team back to relevancy, and winning the first title for the city of Chicago since Michael Jordan did it back in 1998. But I want to know what you guys think though. Let me know in the comments what you thought of DeMar's interview with Draymond Green. And as always, guys, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.